You're listening to FireWall Chats with the IT-ISAC. In Episode 8, security researcher and Stanford University student Jack Cable joins us to discuss coordinated vulnerability disclosure programs. He is also a top-ranked bug bounty hacker and began working at the Pentagon's digital service after placing first in the Hack the Air Force Challenge. He was named one of Time Magazine's most influential teens for 2018. Jack currently studies computer science and launched Stanford University's bug bounty program, one of the first in higher education.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Scott Algier. I'm the Executive Director of the IT-ISAC. It's my pleasure today to be joined by Jack Cable, a security researcher and Stanford University student. Jack, thank you for joining us.
Great, thank you for having me.
Sure, excellent. So, Jack, I wanted to talk with you about coordinated vulnerability disclosure and vulnerability disclosure programs in general. So can you talk a little bit about how you first got interested in vulnerability disclosure programs?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about this. I got started when I was a sophomore in high school. I found my way somewhat accidentally in the world of security. I was building an integration for a financial website and noticed a way to send negative amounts of money to other users on the website. So rather than sending money to their accounts, it would instead steal money from their accounts. So at the time, I didn't know much about security, but I knew that that was a pretty bad thing. But fortunately, that company had a bug bounty program where they would pay people for finding vulnerabilities in their systems. So that was my first introduction to security. I was able to report the vulnerability to them, got paid for it, and really just saw how much they valued this work. And from there, I was really motivated to learn more about security. I started getting into more bug bounty programs, participating in vulnerability disclosure programs, eventually found a program called Pentagon, which was the government's first bug bounty program, where the Pentagon invited 600 hackers to find flaws in its systems. So I participated in that, a number of other ones, eventually started working then for the Defense Digital Service, which ran the Hack Pentagon program, as well as the Department of Defense's vulnerability disclosure program.
Thank you, Jack. So that's really interesting. So there's quite a background, and you touched on a lot of things there. And I think one thought I'm going to ask you to hold on to is the bug bounties versus vulnerability disclosure programs, because I think that there's distinction between those two that we want to tackle in a bit. But first, before we do that, can you first level set us on what is coordinated vulnerability disclosure?
So coordinated vulnerability disclosure is the process by which a company states how security researchers can find them and contact them if a vulnerability is found. So you can think of it like see something, say something for security vulnerabilities. So when a researcher finds a security vulnerability on a company's website, for instance, they need a way to know who to report them to and what process to go through in order to get that vulnerability resolved. So a coordinated vulnerability disclosure policy says what the company expects from researchers and what the researchers can expect from the company. In this way, they can form a mutual relationship to get those vulnerabilities fixed, make the company more secure, and allow the researcher to know that their efforts were put to good use.
What would be some elements that you would be looking for in coordinated vulnerability disclosure programs? So if a company were to have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program, what elements in it would make it a successful one?
The key component that I look for in any vulnerability disclosure policy is known as a safe harbor. And essentially what it is saying is that in exchange for the researcher playing by the rules of the organization's policy, the organization will agree not to take legal action against the researcher. So in a way, this is kind of fulfilling the organization's end of the promise. They're getting free help from the researcher, and they reciprocate by telling the researcher that their activities will be appreciated, that they will not take legal action against them, and that they can be assured that their efforts will only help make the company more secure. So this is one of the major components that companies can provide because, of course, this process is inherently risky for the researcher. There are laws saying, for instance, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, that any unauthorized access to a system is illegal. So that safe harbor authorizes that activity for the purpose of reporting vulnerabilities directly to the company. And that is a key component that researchers look for. With regards to other components of a vulnerability disclosure policy that are key, I would say the Other important part is just to very clearly define what is and is not allowed, including what systems are in scope or are not in scope, which again, idea of kind of a clear policy that is accessible to researchers. There's an organization called disclose.io. It's their website that publishes open source vulnerability disclosure terms as well as safe harbors. So that's a really good resource to get a sense of what exactly is the industry standard to put in a vulnerability disclosure policy. But essentially, at the number one most important thing is having that safe harbor, fulfilling your company's end of the deal to not take legal action against researchers, and then being sure to clearly define the rules of engagement, the scope, kind of how researchers should abide by these rules, and then also how your company will abide by the rules. That's really what makes up a vulnerability disclosure policy.
Thank you, Jack. So what level of communications do researchers expect once they disclose the vulnerability to an organization? So if an organization submits a vulnerability to an organization via the correct channels, what type of communication is suggested back to the researcher?
That's a really great area to bring up. Communication is a core part of interacting with security researchers, and generally they do expect a good amount of communication from the organization, just because at the end of the day, they are providing this information to your company for free. So they should at least be informed of, say, the steps that are being taken to remediate the vulnerability. It's also common for researchers to be asked to retest a vulnerability once the company believes they fixed it. And then at the end of the loop, typically companies may acknowledge the researcher in some way, whether sending them a thank you email to confirm that the vulnerability has been fixed. Some have a public, say, Hall of Fame, where they acknowledge people who reported vulnerabilities to them. Others, as we'll get to later, actually go and pay you a bounty reward for finding the vulnerability. But in either case, yes, communication is a large part of this and is something that researchers do expect when engaging with your vulnerability disclosure policy. So even though it can seem kind of simple to spin up at first, just put up a website saying, contact us here when you find a vulnerability, there really is a whole process that has to go behind a vulnerability disclosure policy, both on the end of communicating with the researchers, validating that reports are indeed actual vulnerabilities, retesting them when they're fixed, but then also on the internal side, kind of prioritizing vulnerabilities to be fixed, coordinating patches, all of that needs to go in place in order to have a well-functioning vulnerability disclosure policy.
Excellent, thank you. So on your coordinated vulnerability disclosure, it's really a process between the researchers and the organization that received the vulnerability reported to them. It's really a process among them to confirm the vulnerability, to confirm mitigations of the vulnerability, to jointly announce the disclosure of the vulnerability once the fix is available, and then to give credit to the researcher who discovered the vulnerability. Yes?
Exactly, yeah.
Super. So I warned you that we were going to be coming back to bug bounties. So I think this is the time to do that. So we've spoken quite a bit about vulnerability disclosure policies and coordinated vulnerability disclosure. You mentioned in the beginning of the podcast here about your experience in bug bounties. So can you clarify what the difference is between a vulnerability disclosure policy and bug bounties?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so just first to define them. So like I said, a vulnerability disclosure policy is a see something, say something, where a researcher reports vulnerabilities to you, you work to remediate that and give the researcher legal protection. A bug bounty takes that a step further, where it still is everything that the vulnerability disclosure policy is, but then for valid vulnerabilities that are reported, the company may pay the researcher a bounty for reporting that. So it's essentially incentivizing this research because companies know that they alone cannot find all of their vulnerabilities. So by engaging a community of researchers out there, they can do a better job of finding more severe vulnerabilities that they can then remediate. In terms of kind of which avenue to take first, I would recommend every organization out there, no matter how large or small, to establish a vulnerability disclosure policy. This is quickly being seen as an industry standard. I think within the next few years, we'll see nearly every organization start one. Even in the US government, say, the Department of Defense has been operating its vulnerability disclosure policy for 4 years, since 2016. But this December, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency announced a draft directive where they would require every federal civilian agency to start their own vulnerability disclosure policy. So this would essentially be making there's over 100, I think, the civilian government agencies start this policy with, for instance, a safe harbor requires they need to give researchers that authorization in exchange for playing by the rules. And that directive is also a really good reference. It follows all of these best practices. So in terms of bug bounties versus vulnerability disclosure policies, start with a vulnerability disclosure policy, get that out there. And then if your organization wishes to go deeper, if they think that there's more that could be found by actually incentivizing people to participate, bug bounty can be a really great option for doing that.
In your experience, Jack, do any organizations combine the two? So, for example, do organizations pay researchers who may have discovered a vulnerability on the network or in a product, and then part of the vulnerability disclosure program, the organization pays the researcher for finding and reporting that to them?
Yeah, so typically the way that this is structured, if a company has a bug bounty, is that essentially the bug bounty terms include everything that the vulnerability disclosure policy would. So for instance, the legal safe harbor, definition of scope, all of that, the bug bounty terms encompass that, and then add on, say, specific terms for how rewards are determined, maybe what severities qualify for what amount of reward, and so on. So yes, they can add on to that. A lot of companies, and some of the biggest tech companies out there, operate public bug bounty programs where anyone can submit a report. There are also private bug bounty programs offered by a variety of platforms where these you actually need to be invited to, and they might have a little more strict rules around disclosure. But yeah, in general, for those public bug bounty programs, they operate essentially as a vulnerability disclosure policy with an added award for reporting actual vulnerabilities.
Excellent. Thank you for that. There's a lot of confusion about terms often in this space. For example, I think in the past, some people have referred to the term responsible disclosure, but that is now subsumed by coordinated vulnerability disclosure. Is that correct?
Yes, so responsible disclosure was one of the main terms used to refer to this process years before. I would say generally, yes, that organizations are phrasing out responsible disclosure for the term coordinated vulnerability disclosure, just because they do refer to the same process, but the word responsible in some cases implies that doing anything else is irresponsible. And there may be entirely valid reasons why someone would not stick to that. Say if a company just never responds to the report, they take other negligent actions that warrant, say, a stricter response from the researcher. But because of that, people are now more in favor of using the term coordinated vulnerability disclosure just to refer to that this is a process, but not necessarily passing judgment on people who participate in it or choose not to.
Thank you, Jack. And I guess finally, another question around the value to companies, right? So what's the value for companies in engaging researchers in this manner? How does engaging with researchers enhance the security of companies?
Yeah, I think that these programs really are immensely valuable just because this is literally free help. This is someone coming to you voluntarily. If it's a vulnerability disclosure policy, not getting paid for it, all they're doing is bringing vulnerability to you with the sole intention of having you fix it. So the fact that there's people out there who are this well-intentioned and want to help improve your organization's security is really amazing. And organizations just need to capitalize on this by defining how people can come to them with vulnerabilities. Something that the CISA directive that requires all federal agencies to start a vulnerability disclosure policy, something that the directive says really well is that organizations should assume that any vulnerability that has been reported to them is already in the hands of an adversary. So if someone is well-intentioned enough to report a vulnerability to you that they find, organizations should assume that adversaries who are likely much more skilled and much more motivated have already discovered this vulnerability. So all vulnerability disclosure policy is doing is aggregating these vulnerability reports that good faith researchers are willing to provide. And it's not like these vulnerabilities aren't out there if an organization doesn't have a vulnerability disclosure policy. They're just only in the hands of the adversaries then. So in a way, a vulnerability disclosure policy is effective in giving defenders more information to protect their systems with regards to specific vulnerabilities. In the security realm, I think that's really just a no-brainer that when someone is offering you free help, you should take them up on that. That's exactly why organizations should be implementing vulnerability disclosure policies.
Yes, free help. That is certainly something I think most organizations can benefit from, assuming, of course, the help is good and high quality, right? That it contributes to the corporate mission. So, Jack, that's great. Thank you for these comments and for your comments today and for talking with us. I really appreciate and enjoyed speaking with you. I have enjoyed getting to know you and working with you more through the IT-ISAC's work in the elections industry. So thank you for your time today. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we exit?
No, I think that's about it. Yeah, thank you for having me here. I think this is really valuable to encourage more companies to adopt these policies.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Jack. Appreciate your time and have a great afternoon.
All right, you too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of FireWall Chats with the IT-ISAC. For more 20 in 20 content, please visit www.it-isac.org.